Yes, it's time for Uncancelled, in which we tackle the dark underbelly of the news agenda. I'll be doing it with my fantastic panel tonight. This evening, is America now in the throes of a full-blown identity crisis, with battles between freedom-loving libertarians versus hard-left woke campaigners, not to mention the growing strategic, security and economic threat from China? To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome Victor Davis Hanson, whose book's called Dying Citizen: How Progressive Tribal Elites, Tribalism and Globalisation Are Destroying the Idea of America. Now, Victor is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and he's also the author of the best-selling book, The Case for Trump. And he joins me now. Hi, Victor.
Hello, how are you?
Great to have you on the program. I'm very well. Before we get to your brand new book, is the case for Trump still a strong one?
The case for the Trump agenda, as we talked about before, I think there's so many Republicans now that have adopted and institutionalized, this idea of getting tough on China or producing more fuel or restoring industrial policy in the Middle West, closing the border, and then the disasters of the last 9 months in the Biden administration. So yes, the agenda is there, but it's a question of who is the best emissary. Trump at 78 years old in 3 years, or somebody like Trump that fights, but maybe avoids some of the tweets, as we saw in Virginia, that the suburban 3 to 5% of the electorate can make a difference. And they seem to enjoy the fact that Trump was successful, but that he was banned from Twitter and Facebook.
Well, let's talk about your latest book, which is winning plaudits across the board. It's so fascinating. Dying Citizen: How Progressive Tribal Elites, Tribalism and Globalisation Are Destroying the Very Idea of America. And you go into detail about what citizenship means, and that citizenship, being a citizen, is a very modern idea and a uniquely American idea, and it's under threat.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a Western idea, so you have it in Europe, and of course, we inherited the idea in part from Britain, but it's very fragile, and the idea that citizens can pick their own leaders and have the confidence and the ability to audit them and keep them accountable. They can, the middle class is broad enough to check the power of the wealthy insider and the subsidized, in some ways, poor. That's not as an independent voice, and they have secure borders. All of that ingredients that makes a constitutional society is very hard to achieve. And we did a pretty good job for 233 years. But when you start to erode the power, the autonomy of the middle class, or you have no border, as we do not on the South, or you revert to a pre-civilizational identification by superficial appearance, then you've got these pre-civilizational forces wrecking it. And then when you add to the matrix sophisticated elites that are, 2 million people in the federal government are not elected, whether it's the CIA people or FBI or Anthony Fauci, whoever they are, they're judge, jury, and executioner of policy. And then we have evolutionaries that want to change the Constitution. We have people feel that they're closer to Europe or Britain or citizens of the world. They see nothing exceptional or unique in being an American.
And why do you think that the erosion of the concept of citizenship threatens the idea of America itself?
Well, I think the idea, and from the British Empire, that you guys civilized, quote unquote, the entire world, but Dickens was writing about existential problems at your core. And what I'm getting at is, if you dilute the idea and you are going to put pride flags on the embassy in Kabul, or you're going to have a gender studies at the University of Kabul, you're going to have George Floyd posters, and you're going to spend all of these billions of dollars, and then but you can't ensure free speech or confidence or a non-tribal idea, then it doesn't work. You're expending your energies in places that are not essential. So here we were trying to convince the Afghans that they had secure borders and they were not just tribal people that migrated in and out of Iran or Pakistan, and yet we have no borders. Or we tried to tell them you have to have civilian control over the military, and we had a military that was interrupting the chain of command. So we were weak at the core, and yet we were projecting pseudo-strength abroad, and the Taliban sort of called our bluff, and it was a hollow effort in Afghanistan, but it reflected the fact that we have not concentrated on empowering the middle class, holding our officials accountable, and living by the laws and customs and traditions of our Constitution.
And do you think that measures seen during the pandemic, an increased role of the state, has had an impact on this particular?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Those were ignition switches. The pandemic, the first lockdown in our history, the first induced recession, the George Floyd death, the 120 days of looting and rioting, the Capitol's number 6 of January, and then especially 102 mail-in ballots. We had 63% of the electorate, never had that, even close, that did not vote on election day. You put all that together, and these pre-existing problems that we discussed, they just exploded. I don't know whether they would have been delayed or postponed had we not had that perfect storm of events, but absolutely, they set everything off. And it was one or two might have been tolerable, but altogether, too much.
Well, I worry for states like California, which is where you're speaking to us from. What a beautiful part of the world it is. I've got family in Napa Valley and New York as well. New York State, New York City, you know, one of the most beautiful metropolises on the planet. But both of those states left-leaning, and they've more or less, you know, just become mini communist dictatorships, haven't they? There has been pushback, though, in places like Florida and Texas, who lifted COVID restrictions. And do you think the likes of Ron DeSantis, the governor in Florida, can rescue America?
Yeah, I think what's happening is two things are happening. People are self-selecting under our federal system. So people are migrating out of New York, Illinois, California because of the high taxes, the regulations, and yet very little in return. Terrible schools, terrible infrastructure, high crime, etc., homelessness. And Florida and Texas then did not lock down. In the case of Florida, they had fewer deaths than New York, a little bit more than California, but their GDP, their unemployment were not destroyed, as happened in Illinois and New York, New Jersey, and California. And then the other thing that's happening is that we saw this Tuesday in the election, even though the left has controlled Wall Street, the corporate boardroom, Silicon Valley, professional sports, entertainment, K through 12 academia, all of the levers of influence and communication, they were getting smug about it, and they never really appealed to the people. People never bought into the border policy, critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. So these were heart of blue America, of left-wing America. That is Virginia, right near Washington, D.C., New York, Minneapolis, New Jersey, and yet in all of these places in these local and regional and state elections, the left was repudiated. And that it just seems incomprehensible that, and their strongholds where they were so confident that average suburbanites or Trump support, everybody got up and was outraged at the critical race theory, outraged at transgenderism, outraged at the smugness and the arrogance of these unelected officials and elected officials in some cases.
With me, Victor, are three esteemed British journalists, Hilary Freeman, Benedict Spence and Benjamin Loughnane. And Hilary, what are your thoughts about where America's going? And should we worry? Could it impact Britain?
Well, I think both Britain and America seem to be going through a bit of an identity crisis at the moment. I don't think people really know what it means to be British either. I'm not very familiar with America, I have to say. I don't have family there. I don't speak to people there particularly. But in this country, certainly, I don't think that we know who we are anymore. And I think it is a problem. And I think this is why there seems to be so much polarisation that seems to be coming along.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Benedict, what's your view on this?
I don't see it so much as the sort of the end of the United States, more as sort of a cultural struggle over the evolution of the United States. If you want to compare it as, the global empire compared to previous global empires, be it the British Empire, be it the Roman Empire, actually they never stood as one sort of homogenous thing in perpetuity. There were periods of evolution and change, and I think that that's all that this is, because I know that a lot of people, we have this quite doomerist attitude, certainly here in the West, and in what is essentially the 51st state of the United States. Culturally Britain is moving very much in the orbit of the United States, and we can't get away from that. But this idea that we're heading towards the end of America in some sort of capacity, and there is this fear that China is going to rise up and it's going to overtake the United States, and I think that attitude is incredibly sort of internalized, because ultimately it doesn't take into account the realities of the difficulties that China is facing, everything from its demographic issues to its geostrategic issues, its neighbours on its borders, the threats that it faces from India to the south and obviously Russia to the north, the issues that it has with Afghanistan on its border, the threats that would come from Japan were it to try to take on Taiwan. We have this idea, don't we, that because culturally the United States is going in one direction, that therefore it is only downhill. But I still don't see actually something supplanting the United States. Certainly China is a threat, but I don't share this view that we are actually facing the impending catastrophe. And I don't necessarily think that there is one political ideology in the United States, be it Bidenism, be it Trumpism, that is the solution to what it's currently going through.
Victor?
Yeah, I did entitle the book "The Dying Citizen," not "The Dead Citizen," and we are at the pinnacle of American power, cultural influence. But at the core, there's some existential problems in this country. And if you go to cities like Los Angeles or New York or Chicago or San Francisco, you will see 200 or 300 aggregate 1,000 people living on the street, defecating, fornicating on the street.
Yeah.
And we have 2 million people who cross the border illegally who were not asked to be vaccinated. And we are going to fire within 2 weeks anybody in the U.S. military or the federal government, despite high antibodies in some cases with prior cases of COVID, if they're not vaxxed, something we don't ask of the non-citizen. We're $30 trillion in debt. We just borrowed $2 trillion this year. We're printing $3 trillion more. We've got about a 7% inflation rate as we speak. U.S. military suffered the greatest humiliation since Saigon 1975. I could go on. We were the leading producer of gas and oil in the world 9 months ago. We deliberately shut down 2.5 million barrels per day, and gasoline has gone up by 40%. Natural gas has doubled. This is all in nine months. And I don't even need to get into the racial questions, but we are the most polarized racially I've seen in my lifetime, where people are even if they're not conscious of race, they are re-tribalizing in a very pre-civilizational fashion because they feel that group is going tribal, then I'll go tribal. And that's a very scary thing because we had kind of solved that problem.
Briefly, Benjamin Loughnane, is America an example of go woke, go broke?
Well, yeah, I think it's part of the entire part of decline is that people start to internalize a lot of their squabbling. You start to question whether, people in the past or the way that your nation was built was on colonialism or this, that and the other. And I think when you engage in those sorts of squabbles while countries like China are spending their time and resources on trying to dominate the world, or Russia or Iran or any of these other countries who have ambitions to build empires, we are going to end up declining and they're going to end up taking over. And when they take over and they're not asking those questions about ethics and morality, the world will be a much worse place for everyone. So I think to some degree we need to start regaining some internal confidence so that, fundamentally we have great values. All of Western philosophy has led to these ideas of, liberty and freedoms and respecting one another and the rule of law and so on and so forth. And in order to ensure that those things remain in place, we need to start having some idea of who we are, what we believe in, and what our ambitions are in a global sense.
Clearly, Victor, America's not. The book is fascinating. America's, is poorly. The patient is poorly but not dead. What's your prognosis? What do you think's going to happen?
I remain confident. I think this one value of this country is it's hypercritical of itself to the point of nihilism and anarchy, but it is self-correcting. And what we saw throughout the country right now, if you look at any poll, all of these things I just delineated have about 30% approval in the polls. The president is about 15% underwater right now in some polls, 10 in all of them. And there's no support whatsoever, if you look at any way it's phrased, for critical race theory or any of this BLM or Antifa stuff. And we're looking at the fumes. I think it's already peaked, but it's done a lot of damage to the country. I'll just finish very quickly by saying it has global ramifications, because the reason that Europe can spend 2% or less on defense, or the reason that North Korea doesn't go into South Korea, or the reason that Taiwan is not invaded, or the reason that Russia pulls back, is the sense of U.S. deterrence, that the United States was a very, very powerful economic and military, and it was better than the alternative. It wasn't perfect, but it could deter these countries, and it enforced the post-world order. And if those people abroad, Putin, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, feel that the United States is torn apart, they will do something stupid, and they will convince themselves they have more power than they really do, and will be in a war. So I'm very worried about that, because Putin gave a lecture the other day with kind of a Cheshire cat smile and said, "Ha, we done all this during the Bolsheviks. We did this. We canceled people. We toppled statues. You're going to do the same thing that we did. You're going to be as weak as we are. You lost the Cold War." And the Chinese are just the opposite. They're saying, this is pretty good. I like the idea of calling everybody a racist. So the very thought that this virus came from the Wuhan lab, that's racist. And the idea it might be engineered, that's racist. And the idea that you're arresting Chinese, exchange professors at American universities because they're part of the Chinese, that's racist. So our enemies are enjoying it for a variety of reasons. And I think if something were to happen and the United States were not be able to, with its allies and NATO partners, fulfill its responsibilities, the world's going to be a very much more dangerous place.